Okay, continuing on, we're going back into the pre-flood world section, and the part that we're on now. Well, first of all, if you're listening by audio, go to creationliberty.com, type in flood, and you'll find an article called "The Pre-Flood World." If you're listening by YouTube, you can click on the link in the description. That'll take you there, and we're on a section called "Changing the World: Hyperbaric Oxygen." And so first of all, let me recap what we did last week. We talked about how that there are, well, the creation of the pre-flood world, basically, that you've got a firmament, and that there's water above the firmament, and we talked about the ice canopy, and we gave a bunch of details about that. So if you haven't listened to that, you may want to go back to that first and read through a lot of those details. And we're going to talk about not just that, and how this ice canopy, what it would have done is block out harmful radiation. So now we have a section. We're going to talk about hyperbaric oxygen, and this hyperbaric oxygen basically just means oxygen under pressure. Okay, typically any kind of hyperbarics has increased oxygen, and they put it under pressure. Now, this is important for a number of reasons that we're going to have to take some time on this one. Okay, but the first I want to start off and talk about how there's a theory that came out that said a lack of oxygen, not an asteroid, killed the dinosaurs. Now, I know this is totally evolutionary, and it's a bunch of nonsense. And basically, if you want to learn more about dinosaurs that may still be alive today, you want to go and just type in the word dinosaur at creationliberty.com. There's an article called "Dinosaurs in the Bible," to which you can get more information. And I really need to do an update on this one and clean some stuff up, add in new information. There's a bunch of stuff I need to do to that. So it is a bit of an older article, but the point still applies. And so you can go and you can look more up about that, because we're not going to talk about that today. But, and of course, that evolution is a religious cult, and we have an article called "Evolution, Another New Age Religion." So if you just type in evolution into the search bar at creationliberty.com, you can see an article on that. And we do have an entire, I think, like a 4-part teaching or something like that on evolutionism and what that really is. So, but even the evolutionists, as far gone as they are from reality, even they are saying, wow, you know what? There really would have had to have been a higher increased amount of oxygen in our atmosphere in the past. This article from the Washington Post, called "Lack of Oxygen Blamed for Dinosaurs' Extinction," this was posted back in 1993. It said, quote, "Dinosaurs were not done in by a giant asteroid, as the prevailing theory holds, but by a change in the atmosphere that provided insufficient oxygen to support their insufficient respiratory systems. A new theory suggests an 80-foot-long brontosaurus had a set of nostrils about the same size as a horse's. For example," said Richard A. Hingst, a Purdue University physiologist. "There were some serious problems with trying to get air into that animal," Hingst said. "Dinosaurs could not have existed without having more oxygen in the air to start with," end quote. So what he's saying here is that if you can imagine in your mind a horse, you've got the horse breathing in through his nostrils, okay, which is going to affect how much air they can actually get. And through their respiratory system for just a horse, okay? And they get to breathe in pretty heavily after a good run. Now, an Apatosaurus, 80 feet tall, we're talking about many, many, many times larger than a horse, had nostrils the same size? How was an Apatosaurus that big able to get enough oxygen to support its entire body mass? That doesn't even logically make sense under today's current atmospheric conditions. And so even these evolutionists are finally jumping on the bandwagon to say, wow, you know what, there may have been more oxygen in the past. Now, part of the reason they've discovered some of this, and there's some correlating evidence to it. Now, if you guys remember, there's the movie Jurassic Park many, many years ago. There was, that was Jurassic Park, I remember. I think my sisters were going to watch that movie when I was, I don't know, it may have come out when I was 10 or something like that. I was young. But I love dinosaurs. I wanted to go see this so bad, and they were going to see it, and they don't want to bring their little brother with them. But I think my mom and dad made them take me with them because I was begging to go. And look, my mom could probably tell you from when I was younger, I didn't really beg for a whole lot when I was younger, but that I begged to go. I really wanted to go see it. So anyway, and it was so funny because I remember my one of my sisters once, like the whole time we were watching it, I mean, all the scary parts, I was just taking everything in when I was little, and, you know, during the scary part, she was covering her eyes, but I was watching all of it. I was like, oh, raptors, this is so cool. Anyhow, getting past that, in that movie, I'm not that I'm encouraging people to watch it. It is total evolutionary propaganda. I mean, it's disgusting how much evolutionism is in that, and it's just a bunch of New Age concepts too. I mean, it's ridiculous. But in the movie, the whole point was that they were going to have these little mosquitoes they were finding. Like they were digging through the earth, and they were finding these amber pockets that would have a mosquito inside. And they said the blood of the mosquito, they would bite a dinosaur, and the mosquito blood would have dinosaur DNA that they could mix with a frog and do all that stuff. Now that's impossible, okay? Because a frog is a different kind of animal. It's not the same kind, so you're not going to be able to do that. Number one, there's a genetic limitation. But again, you know, evolution thinks that, you know, if you give enough time, anything can become anything. I mean, it's completely preposterous, but this is what they religiously believe. Anyway, the amber pockets, though, you can't do that with the mosquito. You can't get that stuff out of it. What they have done with amber, because amber is petrified tree sap. Trees have the sap that comes out of them. If you've ever touched a tree that's leaking sap, it gets on your hands, it's all sticky, and it's really difficult to get off your hands. But when sap dries, it becomes rock hard. I mean, this stuff is like concrete rock hard. But inside, it'll trap air pockets, and you'll find air bubbles inside of amber. Well, let me read this from this article from Time magazine. This was back in 1987. It says, quote, "Dinosaurs, it seems, may have breathed easier than we do. Indeed, at a meeting of the Geological Society of America in Phoenix last week, two scientists stunned colleagues by reporting that 80 million years ago, the Earth's atmosphere contained about 50% more oxygen than it does now." Of course, before I continue this, it says, or basically, we need to understand that when they're saying 80 million years ago, they think this amber, because they'll find it in rock that they will say is 80 million years old, which is not the case, okay? That amber actually could have formed even after the flood. It's possible. But a lot of times they'll find amber in coal, because amber is not going to break down the same way that normal biomass will break down. So you'll find amber in coal. And so they say, well, the coal takes millions of years to form. And so that's where they're getting this from. But when you find amber in coal, you know that's pre-flood, because that's where the coal layers would have formed after the flood. So this amber would have formed and dried pre-flood. Now, continuing here in this article, it says, geochemists Gary Landis of the U.S. Geological Survey and Robert Berner of Yale reached their startling conclusion after analyzing tiny air bubbles trapped in bits of amber and the aged and solidified resin of coniferous trees, end quote. So, basically what they did is they took a tiny little drill and drilled in to these air pockets inside the amber, and were able to, I guess, vacuum test these air pockets. I don't know exactly how they kept that sealed to where they could test them, but they found out that they contained 50% more oxygen than it does now. Now, before anybody gets the wrong impression, because I talked to this about, I used to, because I was real foolish back in the day, I used to talk about all this creation stuff to a bunch of unbelievers. And they didn't seem to understand any of these things. And so one of them says, no, human beings could not survive in that much oxygen. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, you take that we've got something like, 21% oxygen is what's in the atmosphere today? And they said, so that would be like over 70% oxygen. No, you're misunderstanding. Not that it's adding 50% more oxygen. It's 50% more oxygen than we have today. So if we had, let's just put it around 20%. If we had 20% more oxygen, then add 10% to that, and so it would be 30% oxygen instead of 20%. Okay? So it would be something like 31 point something percent oxygen, or 32%, something around there. Okay? With an ice canopy around the planet like we talked about last week, you're now creating pressurized oxygen. And there's a reason I talk about this having pressure under it, okay? I'm going to first talk to you about, I may be doing this a little bit out of order, but I was trying to organize the article in that way. So if you're following along, there's a way I've organized it. Let me talk about the benefits of this first, and then we're going to go back and talk about some of why I talk about the atmosphere being under pressure in a potential pre-flood condition here. Now, This is what I'm going to let you listen to here is Carl Baugh. And remember, I told you, Carl Baugh is leavened, so you want to be careful about getting any Bible teachings out of Carl Baugh's ministry, okay? Carl Baugh is, when you get leavened and you get yoked up with the Devil's Church and 501c3 incorporation, you are going to get leavened. That leaven can affect other people. So even though there may be some people not understand why I tell people to exercise caution around these men, this is why, okay? Because the Bible says we're supposed to exercise caution, not because what we personally feel or what we believe. Like I said, I talked about this in the first part. Lorraine and I, we loved Carl Baugh. I loved hanging out with this guy and talking with him, and it's so interesting. There was things that I remember talking about where everybody at the table, we had a whole table of creation speakers there. I could name off names, but it doesn't matter. There's a whole bunch of them. And these people speak around the country and all that kind of thing. And Carl Baugh was there. And the thing is, what I would do, all right, now this was just me, but I like the iron sharpeneth iron thing, okay? And I said, we've got all these Christian minds here. Let's start up a topic. And so I would bring up topics. Like one of them I brought up was the issue of alcohol. So I would bring up a topic and just start asking about that, and let them just run with it. It was a lot of fun. And I remember Carl Baugh, it has a way of giving just very simple, the responses you would expect from a wise old man. That's the way he would kind of do things. And I always remember that. And so they were there, and everyone at the table believed that alcohol was acceptable, and that Jesus drank alcoholic wine and all that kind of stuff, except for myself, Lorraine, and Carl Baugh. And so Carl, I just sat back. I didn't say anything. I just sat back and watched him answer these guys because, again, Carl Baugh's up there in age. He's their senior, so they had to treat him with some respect there. And so they would say, well, it says in the Bible that when they drank this wine, they got a good feeling from it. So that's alcohol. And Carl Baugh says, well, Pepsi gives you a good feeling. So he just had those very simple answers I thought was great. However, the man is leavened, sadly, and I wish I could find a way to rebuke him and get him to sanctify himself and get straight with the Word of God. But folks, I've tried to contact him, and I'll talk about that later, where I tried to contact their office to get some verification of some things. That'll probably be in subsequent teachings we'll do. I'll get to that point. But I've tried multiple times to get a hold of him at their office, and I never can get a hold of him. So that's a problem. Anyway, sorry about that offset story there. Let's listen to Carl Baugh now. He's going to be giving his testimony about his wife going into a hyperbaric oxygen chamber and some of the healing effects. So let's listen to this.
We went in. My wife was wheeled in the wheelchair, and Dr. Fife, just before going into 2 atmospheres of pressure with enriched oxygen, Dr. Fife looked down and he said, "What's that on your foot?" My wife said, "Oh, I dropped some hot water on it yesterday. It'll be all right." He said, "That's oozing." He said, "That's an open wound." She said, "I know it, but it'll be all right." He said, "We'll take care of it." We have a nurse? Anyone with medic? Okay, excellent. How long does it take for an open wound to heal? Okay, with a child, young, metabolism working better, about a week. For an adult, 2 or 3 weeks. That's right, depending on the health of the individual. And my wife's health was compromised. So let's say 10 days. 10 days would be a good norm for a very healthy person. Here's my wife with compromised health, and Dr. Fife said, "We'll take care of it." We wheeled her into the hyperbaric chamber, closed the door, pumped it up to 2 atmospheres of pressure. He used a system where he put a helmet and a plastic apron so he could give her alone the oxygen. I wasn't getting oxygen because I wasn't paying for it. Gave her the oxygen, 100% oxygen. Now, you can't live under 100% oxygen except for short duration. You have to use it up, otherwise you'll build oxygen toxicity. So, ran the oxygen to her head, and so she leaned back, and she had that treatment 22 times, and it saved her life. Then, he ran another oxygen line past her ankle, because there was that open wound. How long should it take for it to heal? At least 2 weeks for an adult. Wow. So he ran that tube past her ankle. performed a very sophisticated medical procedure. He took a plastic bag, engulfed her foot and ankle, crimped it, took duct tape and wrapped it up. Yeah, that's what you do in surgery. Sat back, and he and I talked about the research, what was going on with our hyperbaric biospheric research. So for about 45 minutes later, how long? 45 minutes. My wife said, I think I've had enough oxygen today. You see, when you saturate the deep cell tissue, you get detoxification. It becomes a little uncomfortable. So she said, I think I've had enough oxygen for today. I said, great. Reached up, turned off the feeder to the tubes, took the helmet off her head, and then I wanted to see. Knelt down, unraveled the duct tape, took off the plastic bag, and that open, oozing wound was healed in 45 minutes.
So that's some of the effects that this can have. Now I've got pictures on here which might make some people queasy. I've got it from one of the images I have on here is a person's foot that was healed through hyperbaric oxygen treatment, and that's from the University of Tennessee's Health and Science Center in Chattanooga. This is from an article called Hyperbaric Oxygen Therapy from the Mayo Clinic website. But it says, quote, the increased oxygen dissolves in your blood during hyperbaric oxygen therapy and circulates throughout your body. Oxygen-rich blood stimulates your body to release substances called growth factors and stem cells, which promote healing, end quote. Back in 1987, there was a baby girl by the name of Jessica McClure, and I'm sure today she probably hates being labeled by this. She's probably so sick of it, because it was a big epidemic back in the 1980s from baby Jessica, who did the splits, as she fell down into an 8-inch diameter steel pipe. See, now I couldn't get my foot into an 8-inch diameter steel pipe, but she got her whole body into it, okay? She did the splits, fell in with one leg, the other leg came up right beside her head, and she slid down into this pipe and was stuck down in there for 2 days. Now, after she was stuck down in there all that time doing the splits, well, her parts of her arm and her entire leg turned black from lack of circulation. And the doctors thought we're going to have to just amputate this leg. But one of the doctors made a suggestion. I think there were 1 or 2 doctors in there that made a suggestion. They said, before we start cutting things off, because after all, it was big media attention. It was all over the news, all over America, and some places around the world. So all these doctors, they have to impress everybody, right? So we're gonna be the doctors, to be the intelligent, amazing doctors who are going to get all this attention. And the more attention you get in the media, the more people will recommend you personally, and the more money you make. Okay, you get more money, you get more prestige, that kind of thing. So this is why they try to put their best foot forward on things like this. And it kind of irritates me when people do that. But again, the whole country's respecters of persons. This is what they do. Anyway, they had a suggestion. They said, let's try some hyperbaric. Let's put her in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. And this is from an article called Toddler Alert and Gaining After Long Ordeal in Well from the New York Times in 1987. They said, quote, doctors said it might be several days before they knew whether her foot would develop gangrene and have to be amputated, but after surgery to relieve swelling and increase circulation to the injured foot, and after treatment in a hyperbaric chamber that provided healing oxygen to damaged tissues, they said they were hopeful, end quote. Well, not only hopeful, but they actually ended up healing her entire arm and restoring blood circulation. I mean, her entire leg had turned completely black, but they were able to restore circulation, and it healed all the tissue, and she was walking around like a normal little girl after some time. It took a very short amount of time before her legs started to turn pink and all the circulation restored, because oxygen under pressure is how your bloodstream can easily carry oxygen throughout your body. And then I included a picture of her. She got to visit the White House afterwards, with George H.W. Bush, which I made a comment on this image, he is one of the most evil men who has ever walked the face of the planet, and yes, he is. Okay, that's a whole other topic. We're not going to talk about that today. I mean, there's a number of things that you will find out. I mean, he lied. He was in interviews telling people, I was never in the CIA. But classified documents that got declassified decades later, came to find out that he lied, and he was in one of the head top members of the CIA during the plan that they initiated in order to assassinate John F. Kennedy. So that's a whole nother topic. There's a lot of documentation that actually points directly to him being one of the #1 men involved in that assassination. So anyway, that's a whole other topic. Again, I'm probably going to get a bunch of spam letters over that one too. But this is one of the most evil and wicked men who's ever walked the face of the planet. And yet you have all these so-called Christians out there, people calling themselves, but they're false converts. You know, people like, what's his name? Michael W. Smith, who says, "Oh, George and Barbara, there are good friends." Oh, I bet they are, because you're so much of the world. Anyway, if you want to learn more about Michael W. Smith, and that man is not a Christian, you need to just type his name in. Type in Michael Smith, or just Smith, into the search bar at creationliterary.com and read the article Wolves in Costume, Michael W. Smith, and go get all the information on that. Now, there's a number of hospitals that have begun to increase oxygen levels for patients under surgery, because they found it significantly lowers the risk of post-surgical infection. You see, they think that, oh, well, we have to make sure that the oxygen level stays at the same atmospheric condition that we have here, but wait a second, if you bump it up some, it actually has healing effects. This is from an article called Oxygen Halves Infections from Lions Daily News that was posted in the year 2000. It says, quote, "Scientists already knew that the white blood cells known as neutrophils use oxygen to kill germs, and they knew that high levels of oxygen in body tissues help prevent infection, and that breathing higher levels of oxygen put more oxygen into the tissues. What they did not know was whether it made a difference in patients' healing. This shows it's not just a theoretical benefit, but a real benefit, and that it's much greater than you might have expected," end quote. One of the guys that got us started in ministry, I volunteered to take him out because he was very ill, to a Hyperbaric Oxygen clinic that does hyperbaric oxygen treatment, and they have people from all around the world come out there. It's called the Cole Center for Healing, that's in Cincinnati, Ohio. I talked to Dr. Cole and their supervisor over the hyperbarics, which is, his name's Scott Furr, and I put their phone number on here because I've been there before, and I've talked to them. You can call them up and talk to them, and they'll talk to you about the procedures they do. But he says that they're having amazing healing results with stroke patients and autistic patients. It's actually quite interesting because that has to do a lot with how it's getting oxygen to your brain, because a stroke and autistic patients, a lot of that has injuries to their spine and to their brain, and that's where your body that cannot carry certain oxygen molecules that far unless they're under pressure properly, because that pressure will help to get oxygen to your entire body, which is why there's been some people who've given testimony that says they've had miraculous healing results with Alzheimer's patients who did not know who they even were when they went in, and after an hour under hyperbaric oxygen walked out with all their memories intact. I've read testimonies of that before. I guess I didn't think to put that in the article yet. I guess that's something maybe I should look into, try to find some of that again and put that in there, but I haven't done that as of yet. Because again, there's not a whole lot of people who will talk about some of these healing effects that they have, because again, it's not pharmaceutical medicine, okay? I don't even want to call it medicine, it's sorcery, but it's not pharmaceuticals, it's not psychiatrics, all right, and psychiatry. It's not any of that stuff. So it's not considered real medicine, according to the world, according to mainstream. So anyway, you've got 80-foot tall dinosaurs that could not have survived with just increased oxygen. Okay, if you bumped up oxygen from 20 to 30%, that's not going to be enough for an 80-foot Apatosaurus. But if you put that oxygen under pressure, that would be sufficient in order for a creature of that size to be able to breathe and survive. Now, our atmosphere today can't hold that kind of pressure, but if you have that crystalline canopy that we talked about last week surrounding the firmament, it would trap in the oxygen under pressure. And we'd have hyperbaric conditions all over the world all the time, which would result in a lot more than just being easier to breathe and accelerated healing. There's more that we can discuss here. And we're going to go on to talk about some of the giant animals and insects. Now, I want to mention one thing here that I need to apologize to everyone for, is that at the end of the Seminar 1, The Age of the Earth, I had talked about going on to Seminar 2 to talk about some of the issues that we're talking about today. When I did that, I included some things that I had heard before that were not true, and it's kind of, the video is already made and there's nothing I can do to really fix that now, and I apologize, and all I can do is apologize to people. and ask forgiveness for that, and try to fix it in the future if I can. But I don't know if I ever see myself recording another one of these series, because it's almost a waste of my time. For the most part, you almost cannot get into talking about creation anywhere unless you play this churchianity political game where you have to have a bunch of prestige and respecting of persons, and it's a bunch of leaven I don't want to get involved in. So unless you do a bunch of that, most of the time you cannot get in to talk about any of these issues to the average church building, because they don't want you anywhere nearby if you're actually sanctifying yourself. That's a whole other topic. Anyway, this is another part where I'll talk about Kent Hovind and how folks, for those of you out there, you might be a Hovinite, okay? And the reason I call them Hovinites is because, folks, I used to be one. I used to take everything Kent Hovind said as the absolute truth, and that kind of thing. And that's where I have to apologize to the Lord God that I ever did that. And I don't want to be like that. I want to be able to check out His Word and go check out sources and references and study to show myself approved unto God. Okay. And Kent Hovind is not the Pope of creationism. He is not the final authority in all matters of faith and practice. There are certain things that he had in his seminar. Like, for example, what I talked about when I did the preview for the next seminar at the end of them, I talked about a 18-inch cockroach fossil, and I used to talk about that in different church buildings I was speaking at and all that. And the problem is, when I actually went down and dug down research on this 18-inch cockroach fossil, because modern science, they say the largest one that's ever been found has only been about 3.5 inches, which is pretty long. Okay, it's a pretty big roach, but not an 18-inch one. So I was trying to figure out, where is this coming from? Where did he get this 18-inch cockroach fossil? Because the sad part is that if you go to a standard search engine looking these things up, all you're going to find is a ton of forums and, these random unknown blogs from these Christians or creationists writing, talking about an 18-inch cockroach fossil, but nobody ever seems to have it. And the thing that I was finding interesting was that they were all saying it in the exact same way. And here's the sad part. Here's what happens. Kent Hovind will say something in a particular way, then a bunch of all these Hovinites will go behind him and repeat everything he said exactly the same verbatim that he said it. And that's how you know where they got it from. So I'm looking for some other source for this 18-inch cockroach fossil. Come to find out, I think the guy's name is Don Patton. There's a Dr. Don Patton. His testimony was that he had found a fossil of a cockroach 18 inches long. And what happened is, when he brought it home, his wife would not allow him to bring it in the house. Well, it shows you who's the leader in that home. Anyway, she said, "You're not going to bring that thing in the house," so he left it outside, and he said somebody stole it. Now, I believe him. I do, because there's no reason. I mean, if he's going to tell a story like that and make it up, there's nothing he's going to get but ridicule. Why would he make something like that up if all he's going to get is ridiculed? I believe he's telling the truth. However, that is not enough evidence for me to say that they have found a cockroach fossil 18 inches long. But Kent Hovind believes the opposite. He believes that is enough evidence to say that kind of thing, and I don't believe it is, okay? Because the Bible says by 2 or 3 witnesses a thing should be established, all right? And we've only got one. So I don't think that we ought to be going by certain things like that. And for example, Kent Hovind mentions a 3-foot long, a fossilized spider leg 3 feet long. Now, I wouldn't object to that, something like that existing, but there is no evidence for this. Where's the fossil? Where's the evidence? Where's any of the analysis that was done on these things? Where's the testimony for this stuff? It doesn't exist. I can't find any of it. Now, Kent Hovind, often what he does is he goes and he listens to someone tell him a story, and I'm not saying they're lying. Many people tell stories and they're true, okay? But he goes by somebody who gave him a testimony, who told him these things were true, but there is not enough evidence for it. But what he does is he goes and teaches it as if it's a fact of science that's been proven, and that everybody should trust him on that. Folks, you have to be careful. I had one guy, I saw a website actually of somebody, after I had discovered all this, I found some guy's website where he had discovered the exact same thing I did. That the evidence for this, for example, the 18-inch cockroach fossil, he couldn't find it. So what he did is he went and contacted a bunch of different creation ministries that were making this claim, and he says, "Would you provide where you got this information from?" He got 2 responses. He either got ignored, which is like 99% of the ministries he contacted, he got ignored. They wouldn't answer him at all. Or basically, it was some sort of excuse or railing accusation. That's all he could find. Folks, as Christians, is that the way we are supposed to handle information? Is that the way we're supposed to treat one another? But you see, that's why I call them Hovenites, is because they've got as bad as the Ruckmanites. Basically, whatever Peter Ruckman says is directly from the mouth of God, and that's exactly the way they're treating Kent Hovind in the same way. Folks, we cannot do that. We cannot... the Bible says in Jeremiah 17, we just read that in our first half, that cursed be the man that trusteth in man, that maketh flesh his arm, whose heart departeth from the Lord. If you're trusting implicitly in a Peter Ruckman or Kent Hovind or anybody, or even me, if you're trusting implicitly in those people, you are making flesh your arm, and your heart is departing from God. You need to go search these things out for yourself to determine what's true, okay? So anyway, getting past that, there have been centipede fossils. They've been found up to 8.5 feet long, centipedes, and scientists call them Arthropleura. You can go look that up. There's a National Geographic article that I give to on that one that was published back in 2011. And they've also found fossilized fleas that have been discovered 6 times larger than normal. From this article from Science News in 2012, they said, quote, ancient fleas were larger and had longer siphons to suck blood with than today's fleas. Researchers report in a study published online February 29th in Nature, the fossils measure as much as 6 times the size of a modern human flea, end quote. So you have, when it says a human flea, you've got fleas that will bite onto humans, and you have other types of fleas that won't. There's cat fleas typically will not bite onto humans. They will only go onto cats and then sometimes to dogs, depending on what variety it is. So you have different varieties of fleas. And there are a very rare type of human flea, fleas that will live and only feed on humans. And I don't want to say humans, I want to say man, because the word human has such an evolutionary connotation behind it. I did some research on that one time, and I hate the term. But it's kind of in my vocabulary, and if it comes out of my mouth, I apologize. That's just... It's kind of in there, and I'm trying to get it out, but that's the best I can do. Anyhow, there's fossils of dragonflies they've found that have been discovered 4 times larger than normal. Now, according to this this book that's called "What's Bugging You? A Fond Look at the Animals We Love to Hate" from the University of Virginia Press in 2008, said, quote, the largest dragonfly wingspan ever is 28 inches. Today, the world's largest living is 7.5-inch wingspan, end quote. So 28 inches, if you're going to divide that back, that's almost 2.5 feet long. That's a big dragonfly. Really big. And that's the kind of thing that if you're going to, I mean, normally if you're driving down the highway and a dragonfly hits your windshield, it just splatters on it. Well, it's not going to splatter if it's 28 inches. It's going to shatter your windshield at that high velocity. Now, the thing is, insects, and a lot of women out there are like, ooh, these things are so big. Well, it's not just women. I'm kind of like, ooh, that's kind of big too. I really don't want to... I don't like a lot of that stuff. I don't want to see these giant insects everywhere. I don't like them any more than the next person. But at the same time, there's a problem with this, because insects have a limitation to how big they can get, and it's based on something called a surface area to volume ratio. If you're following along the website, I've provided a diagram in here to try to help explain this to some degree. Over audio, however, I'll try to explain it in a different way. Let's say you have a 1-inch ice cube, meaning it's 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch, okay, height, width, and length. And you have an ice cube, and you set it on the counter. And on your countertop, you just leave it out in room temperature, and let's say it takes 30 minutes to melt completely, okay? What happened, and while it's sitting on the counter, it'll start to melt, but you'll notice it's the outsides that are melting, because all the outside is what's getting the heat. Inside, and the center of it, it's still just as cold as when it was in the freezer. But the outsides are beginning to melt, and it slowly gets smaller and smaller, and as it gets smaller, it actually melts faster. In the same way, if you took a same size ice cube and you cut it in half, it will actually only take, well, just throw a number out there, it'll only take maybe 15 to 20 minutes to melt completely. Well, why did it take a shorter time? See, because you have the same amount of volume there. The volume didn't change. What changed is the surface area. Now you have more surface area than you do volume, and more surface area you have means it's going to melt faster. That's the whole concept behind this thing. Now, it's going to work the opposite way with an insect, okay? Because insects breathe through their skin. They don't have lung systems, respiratory systems like we do. They breathe through their skin. They have tiny little holes that are called spiracles, okay? Inside some of the muscle tissue and things like that, they have those. Now, in those holes, they breathe through their skin. And the problem is that when you have a small insect, well, I guess I don't want to say the problem, because when they're small, there is no problem, okay? They can breathe and get enough oxygen. As they get bigger, both the volume and the surface area increase. But here's the problem. The volume increases. As an insect gets larger, the volume increases faster than the surface area, which means you're going to have less surface area to volume ratio as you did when it was smaller. And the thing is, when the insect is breathing in oxygen, it's not feeding its surface area, it's trying to provide oxygen to its volume. So the bigger it gets, the more oxygen it needs, but the bigger it gets, the less oxygen it can get for its volume. Okay? And I hope that helps explain something. I hope most people can understand that in a simplistic manner. Because there's a lot of people that will run right by that topic thinking that everybody understands it, and really there's a lot of people that have a difficult time understanding how that works. But just basically, the bottom line is that insects cannot get too large because they need more oxygen in order to get that big. We see an insect like a dragonfly can't get that big today because there's not enough oxygen in our atmosphere for them to get that big. Okay? And this is the kind of thing that, again, some of these people that are in the religious cult of evolutionism are just now starting to get on the bandwagon to say, wow, there must have been more oxygen sometime in the past. Let me read you this article from, it's entitled, Scientists Find Fossil of Supersized Bug, from the Associated Press in 2007. It says, quote, "This was a bug that you'd have to look up to and definitely couldn't step on. British scientists have stumbled across a fossilized claw, part of an ancient sea scorpion, that is of such large proportion it would make the entire creature the biggest bug ever. How big? Bigger than you, about 2.5 meters or 8 feet long. Some geologists believe that gigantic sea scorpions evolved due to higher levels of oxygen in the atmosphere in the past." End quote. So they said this thing could not have survived that large. It would have to have much more oxygen to do that. So they said, well, there must have been oxygen a long time ago. Of course, they're only suggesting this, but you see, the problem is that is really the opposite of the evolutionary model. Having more oxygen in the past doesn't make sense in any kind of way, which is why they're not really having it. They're saying, well, there must have been, but we have no idea how. It's a very serious problem for the evolutionists. But not only breathing in this oxygen, but also flying becomes a problem for many creatures without, and I'm not talking about extra oxygen, without pressure. You've got to have enough pressure in order for these creatures to fly. So from this National Park Service article called Pterosaurs, it's called National Park Service, it's nps.gov, they said, quote, "Pterosaurs ranged from pigeon size with a wingspan of 18 inches to ultralight airplane-sized Quetzalcoatlus with a wingspan of 36 to 39 feet, end quote. So we have what they call Quetzalcoatlus, that's the type they're calling it, of a pterosaur. This is a type of pterodactyl that has an almost 40-foot wingspan. Most people have a hard time imagining how big that creature would be, but I've got an image of a picture of a skeletal structure of it from the Natural History Museum in Arizona, so you can get an idea of how big these things were. They were extremely large. Now, to get a featherless creature, because the pterosaurs, they didn't have feathers to fly, to get a featherless creature of almost 40-foot wingspan into stable flight, it would require much more air pressure under the air of its wings than we have in our atmosphere today. And that's absolutely required. That creature of that dimension and size could not fly in our atmosphere today. Now, when I was doing research on some of this, I was reading some evolutionists on forums and things like that saying, "Oh yeah, it could fly. That's ridiculous. You're not adding in issues of velocity and all this other stuff. You have no idea what you're talking about." Some of the nastiest, most hateful people saying that yes, it could. Well, I'm going to read you. This is an article from a website called dinosaurtheory.com. The author of this article is an evolutionist. He is not a creationist. Okay. And this article is called "The Science of Flight and the Paradox of Flying Pterosaurs." Now, of course, the man, this author, obviously, he needs to be saved, really. And he needs to come to repentance and knowledge of the truth of the Lord Jesus Christ. However, his article on this was actually really informative. You'd be surprised how well he actually did this, because he used to teach physics at the Arkansas School for Math and Science. And so I'll let this evolutionist professor explain this to these evolutionists out here who may be listening. He says, quote, "How the Quetzalcoatlus and the rest of the Pterosaurs flew would seem to be quite the scientific paradox, and yet the paleontology community continues to insist that there is no scientific paradox regarding how the Pterosaurs could have flown. The most damaging evidence refuting the position of the paleontologists is that they have never succeeded in getting a radio-controlled model pterosaur to fly. Between 1984 and 1986, the Smithsonian gave $700,000 to the aerodynamics expert Paul McCready for the purpose of creating a radio-controlled model demonstrating the flying ability of the Quetzalcoatlus northropi," which is the big one. That's what they're talking about. McCready's team quickly realized that a full-sized radio-controlled model constructed with a weight and power reasonable for this animal would not be capable of flight. So they opted for the half-sized model, weighing only 44 pounds, power launched high into the air with a stabilizing tail that could then hopefully descend gently back to the earth as it flapped its wings. Before I continue his quotation, let me point out something first. They got a half-size model because they couldn't make the full-size model work. So the whole point of trying to prove that a 40-foot creature like that could fly in today's atmosphere totally failed before they even started. Only weighing 44 pounds, which, if you look at the bone structure of this thing over there, it's going to weigh more than 44 pounds, okay? And then it's power launched into the air with a stabilizing tail, which it did not have naturally. And it says to descend gently back to the earth. Not that it was actually going to take off and fly on its own, but they were only getting it to glide, not to fly. There's many problems with this, okay? He continues in his article to say, while not actually flying, and not remotely close to accurately representing a Quetzalcoatlus in size and weight, it was the hope of the paleontology community that the flapping pterosaur model would at least give the appearance of flying. However, their plans failed on May 17, 1986, when in front of the national media, their model radio-controlled pterosaur unceremoniously dove into the ground and broke its neck. According to the newspapers, it was a terrible tragedy. And they spelled terrible with P-T-E-R-R, and tragedy with P-T-R-A. That's how you spell pterosaur or pterodactyl. I thought it was kind of funny, a terrible tragedy. Anyway, continuing. It says, this is not a close call. Pterosaurs could not have flown in today's atmospheric environment. The application of aerodynamic equations show pterosaurs falling far short of meeting the requirements for obtaining flight in today's atmosphere, and the experimental efforts using radio-controlled models provide physical evidence confirming these conclusions. It should be alarming to all scientists and science educators that some paleontologists continue to claim that they understand how pterosaurs flew when the evidence is so overwhelming in refuting their claim, end quote. Now that's directly from the mouth of an evolutionist, okay, who taught physics in math and science. Now here's the same story from the New York Times article that they released on May 18, 1986, quote, 65 million years after nature removed the original from the face of the earth, humans today helplessly watched a $700,000 plastic replica of a flying reptile plunge to the dust of a modern airfield. Seconds after its tow line was disconnected by the flight team, the 18-foot wingspan twisted into a nosedive. Control was briefly regained with directions from an onboard computer, then the pterodactyl replica literally lost its head and plummeted to the earth too rapidly for its emergency parachute to buffer the fall, end quote. Because you know how many birds today have emergency parachutes in their backpacks. So simply increasing oxygen doesn't cut it. If you brought the oxygen up from 20 to 30%, that's not going to cause these giant creatures to fly. I mean, you're going to have problems even with a 28-foot wingspan dragonfly to be able to fly under its weight. So you're going to have certain problems like that, and you're going to need extra oxygen under pressure to get these things to actually be able to function in an atmosphere. And it definitely won't work in the atmosphere we have today. Okay. Now there is one thing I want to mention about Kent Hovind that he used to talk about. He was taking a trip out to speak somewhere, and he happened to be going through Arizona, and he asked Walter Brown, which I told you wrote the book in the beginning, the other 11 creationist, Walter Brown, who doesn't believe that there was a canopy. Okay. Now the problem is, if you take away this canopy, you have nothing left to explain how there was a pressurized atmosphere to where you could get these. I mean, because even increasing oxygen in the atmosphere like we have today is not going to be enough for these for the insects to get large enough. You're going to need that under pressure. And so he stopped by and he talked with Walter Brown for a few hours, and Walter Brown's book, In the Beginning, I mentioned last time. So he decided to ask Walter Brown, well, if you don't believe there's a canopy, how have you solved the problem of the giant insects and the giant pterosaurs having to fly under pressure? How did you solve that problem? To which he said, Walter Brown responded, well, I don't have an answer for that yet. He is just as stumped as the evolutionists on this matter, because, again, 2 Peter 3 said that they were going to be ignorant of the earth standing in the water and out of the water. And that's what that means when it says it's standing in the water. That means there's a layer of water above the firmament. And it's because they are ignorant of that, they cannot see what the world was like before the flood. They cannot see how things have changed, and there's certain things that they're just unexplainable to them. So with each passing decade, they keep finding more fossils and skeletons of these giant creatures. They'll find these fossilized huge things, just like you saw the 8-foot scorpion claw that they found, and they're just shocked by these things. Beaver skulls, for example, have been found that indicate they were twice the size of normal. This is from a book called On the Geological Position of the Apatosaurus ohioensis, which is the giant beaver, is what that is. It says, quote, though a matter of great interest, it is hardly possible to form a very correct estimate of the size of Castroidus, almost the only data offered to us being those given by the cranium. The length of the skull of the animal is 10.5 inches, and its greatest breadth is 7.2 inches, according to Professor Emmons. The skull of an old female beaver measured from the tip of the nose to the crucial ridge 4.9 inches, and its greatest width 3.9 inches. The skull of the Castroidus is therefore a little more than double the size of that of the common beaver. So you have beavers that are going to be more than twice as long as they are today, and some of these fossilized jaws that have been found more recently, because and by the way, that book that was published that I just read to you was back in the 1800s. Today, we have found more things indicating that these beavers were getting over 8 feet long based on the size of their jaws that they find. And there's a number of these giant beaver skulls that are found in different museums all across the country and in some places across the world. But I offer some images here that you can see on the website. It shows you the average size of an average beaver, and there's an 8-foot kayak this lady's standing in front of, and that's basically the size of the beaver that they would have pre-flood. There's a giant salamander skull, and multiple giant salamander skulls actually have been found, according to geologist Joe Taylor, and some have been found large enough to indicate they could reach up to 12 feet long. The one I have on the image here shows that it could reach about 6 feet long. That's the skull that was found there. Joe Taylor has found them larger than that. You can see the average size of a salamander there compared to, which is just a few inches long. Salamanders usually only get around between 5 to 8 inches long, but this one they're showing from this skull was about 6 feet long in the picture. And that's why, when you get into the issues of dinosaurs in the Bible, again, the word dinosaur means terrible lizard. It's giant lizards, because the first one at least recorded to be compared, it's not that it's the first one ever discovered, but the dinosaur, as the dragons were slowly being killed off and they were being driven off, and you don't hear about them anymore, and it starts to fade from the memories of men. Now you have people, like the guy in the 1800s, which is what was claimed to be the first dinosaur discovery. I don't want to say that's the case. It's the first one recorded recently, but in the 1800s, the doctor who was visiting, and he found there were diggers that were digging out for something, I forget what they were digging for, outside this house that he was visiting because he was a medical doctor, and they started pulling up these gigantic bones. And they asked, because the doctor's wife was sitting in the cart, and they said, what are these? And she says, you should really ask my husband to take a look at these things. And he did. He says, he looked at their teeth, and he says, these are exactly like the teeth of an iguana, except they're enormous. And so he called it the Iguanodon. So when you hear the Iguanodon, it's like a giant iguana, basically. So that's why there's a lot of creatures today that there are still dinosaurs still alive. They just don't get as big as they used to be, okay? Not to mention there are other specific types of dinosaurs that many sightings of these dinosaurs have still been found today. things that have washed up on the beach. Again, there's photographs of one of a 20-foot-long neck plesiosaur that washed up on the beach in California in 1925 that's on our website. If you just type in the word dinosaur into the search bar at creationliberty.com, read through that. There's pictures of it on our website that you can see that was analyzed by British scientists who said, we have no idea what this is. It's definitely not a shark, because that's their excuse, that all the evolutionists go, oh, it's just a shark. Show me the neck on a shark, or it's just a whale. Show me the neck on a whale. When's the last, and where is a neck on a whale, period? I mean, it should be somewhere between the head and the flippers, somewhere in there, but when's the last time you saw a neck on a whale? Anyway, but they give any excuse they can because they realize a living dinosaur would totally disprove everything about their evolution theory. Of course, they would come to accept it after a while. Even if they found that, they would just say, oh, look, it survived for 65 million years. That's exactly what they're going to say. They're scared to death of it, but then once it's here, they'll say, well, okay, well, this is what we'll say, it just survived for a very long time. Unbelievable. You see, that's the point, folks, is that I hear these evolutionists all the time say, well, real science has to be falsifiable. Okay, well, thank you. That demonstrates that evolution is not real science because it's not falsifiable. It doesn't matter what it is, they have an excuse that's ready for it. So this is a picture of a skull of an elk with its horns on its head. The horns from tip to tip were 12 feet wide. I mean, this is like the size of a from tip to tip, their horns were the size of a full-size sedan, a car. And this is from a book called The Student's Reference Work. It says, quote, the remains of an extinct elk of gigantic size are found in the peat bogs of Ireland. This Irish elk held its antlers 10 feet high, and they measured 11 or 12 feet from tip to tip, end quote. There's also giant wombat fossils were discovered in Australia back in 2002, but they've also just more recently have been discovered in Europe as well. In Italy, they found these things. And this is from an article called Fossil of Giant Wombat Found in Sorrento from the Herald Sun in 2013. It said, quote, it is the most complete and best preserved fossil of this kind of giant megafauna marsupial discovered in Victoria, and it may yet prove to be the most superbly preserved example of this fossil discovered in Australia. Professor Fitzgerald, who is the senior curator of vertebra paleontology at the museum, said, He said the creature was thought to be close cousin of the Diprotodon, a monster herbivore resembling a wombat, which was almost 4 meters long and nearly 2 meters tall and weighed almost 3 tons, end quote. So it's basically the size of a decent-sized luxury car, this wombat, okay? Guinea pigs have been found the size of buffaloes. According to this article from Science on NBC News, Associated Press, this is 2003, an article called Ancient Rodent the Size of a Buffalo. It says, quote, it would be an exterminator's worst nightmare, a 1,545-pound rodent with a ferocious appetite and big teeth, resembling a guinea pig grown to the size of a buffalo, end quote. So there's actually many more beyond this. I just wanted to give you guys a few examples. They found giant turkeys, giant sharks. I mean, you talk about, people say, oh, Jaws, great white, and great white shark in the movie Jaws was a 25-foot shark, supposedly in the fiction movie, all right? But you would need Jaws as bait to catch a Carcharodon megalodon. I mean, the giant sharks they find are just almost beyond imagination. They're so huge. But anyway, obviously the pre-flood world was very different than what we're seeing today, okay? And so far, based on the evidence we've seen, we've got increased oxygen under pressure, which is creating an enhanced healing, easier breathing, you have larger animals, it's easier for the birds to fly, it enables large creatures to fly, allows these insects to exist like this, and this is already amazing when you also include in that it is blocking out all the harmful radiation on top of that. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of what is possible under these pre-flood conditions in this hyperbaric atmosphere under this canopy, and we're going to go into more details on that and talk about how this would affect the food supply of the world. More on that coming next week, so please come back and visit us again next week. And if you're listening by YouTube, subscribe to us if you want to keep hearing more about the stuff and you enjoy these teachings. So, did anybody have any questions or comments about any of that we just talked about today before we close? Thanks for joining us, everybody. I pray that the Lord Jesus Christ will bless you all as you study His Word and that you seek to glorify Him in all that you do, and we will see you next week.